Welcome to this session on racial diversity. I'm Yohan McDonald. This session is part of the Thrive London programme in collaboration with MHFAE England, which is given programmes across wellbeing platform throughout the year. Thrive LDN is a citywide movement to improve the mental health and wellbeing of all Londoners. And this session is primarily focused on racial diversity. So I'm going to run through the details of the session for you. So let me just move the slides on, bear with me one moment. So the aims and outcomes of this session is firstly to understand what is meant by race, racism and racial diversity. What's the impacts of racism and prejudice on mental health? And so we'll be looking at what are the four main types of racism that can sit within. Then we'll start to talk about the appropriate language for when discussing race, what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, and perhaps if there's any context where some language is acceptable more than others. And then we'll be looking at the frame of reference. What is your own background and thoughts and beliefs and attitudes around racism? Where does that come from? So it's an opportunity to reflect and think about that. There's going to be a great video which is part of the session, and then we'll end with how to have a conversation around mental health and racism. So here's the plan. Racism next. Some simple questions to get you thinking about, well, what are they? What do they mean to you? Where do they come from? Also give you an understanding of mental health. For many of you listening and watching this, you have had some mental health awareness training, maybe mental health first aid as part of the Mental Health First Aid England platform. So we'll be looking at what does mental health look like, and once again in relation to racism. We'll show some statistics to give you some context, look at a continuum to think about where does racism sit on that. We'll be exploring those four types of racism: language, frame of reference, and then end up with how to have a conversation, and then some resources for you to do your own research and some service that you can contact. So a quick introduction to me. So I'm Yohan McDonald. I'm a mental health and wellbeing trainer. Been training in this space around wellbeing since 2015, a wide variety of courses across that platform. One-day courses for mental health first aid, a two-day course, a half-day training courses for managers. And in the last couple of years, there's been a great focus on racism and the impacts on mental health. And I've had the pleasure of delivering many sessions across that platform to new instructors and leaders in the field. My background is I used to work for my local mind in West London, Hillingdon Mind in Harrow, and I have a corporate background, all of which I use actually in my training sessions. So we're going to get into it and start in terms of understanding race and racism, but just by starting with yourself. So what you want you to do is just to think, just for a moment, how do you feel about having a conversation around race and racism? And by the way, in regards to this session, if you have a pen and paper, that'd be great. So it's an opportunity to jot down some of your own thoughts and ideas. But just on this scale that you can see on your screens, where would you put yourself on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 being you're completely comfortable, you have no barriers to it, it's not challenging for you, it doesn't even perhaps excite you. 5 being it's completely overwhelming, you're scared to death of talking about it. In fact, any conversation on racism, you'd probably rather leave the room. So where are you on that spectrum? Just give yourself a moment. Jot it down on your piece of paper where you would see yourself, and be honest. Just be open and honest with yourself. I think it's great to lean in to when we have conversations around racism. It can be uncomfortable, but I don't think that should stop us having that conversation. So if we are a 3, what can we do to get to a 2? If we are a 2, what can we do to improve on that? So if we are feeling uncomfortable, even during the session or outside of this session, it's about, for me, being able to lean into it, because I think that's where we learn the most and the best. So consider that thought for a moment. So the first question for you to think about is, what is race? We hear about it all the time, but how would you define it? Maybe just take a moment to pause the video, write it down. What do you think race is? If you've had any, if you've written down some ideas, here's what the Centre of Health Progress believes is: race is a social construct. It's a human-invented classification system. It was invented as a way to define physical differences between people, particularly skin colour. I think that's really important, actually, when it comes to the first part of it, where it says it's a social construct. Basically, it's been artificially created to separate or define differences in us. So it'd be interesting to consider what was your perceptions of race. The next question for you to think about is what is racism? Because you can see it's on the screen. It says it's prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on a basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. And so for me, that means it's ultimately talking about one group of people over here, one group of people over here, but this group has power over this group. And it's the group that has power, they're the ones that can demonstrate racism towards that marginalized or minority group. Seems quite straightforward, but it's just for you to think about, well, why does racism exist? You know, why would certain groups need power over the others? And there's, I think, is probably lots of reasons for that. For you, it's just the opportunity for you to consider, you know, where do you think it comes from? And if you read some text from people like Akala, whose book Natives, it talks about racism is what drove the British Empire and got it to where it is today. So it can maybe just worth considering from that perspective. But it's good to get us to start to think about what is racism. So we're going to bring in mental health into this conversation. So I want you to think about, how would you describe mental health? So look at these statements. Which one do you think just describes it best? So how we think and feel and behave. Do you think it's about how stress affects us? Do you think mental health is describing our levels of confidence and self-esteem? Or maybe it's talking about our level of optimism, enthusiasm, and drive for life. Maybe it's more a reference to how we deal with problems and challenges in our life. Maybe it's all of the above. Which one do you think? Write down which one you think is the best description of mental health. Pretty simple question, right? So it's number 6. So it's all of the above. And it's quite a broad spectrum as to what mental health is. But it's just getting you to start to think about, okay, well, how would racism fall into that in terms of maybe number 2, how might it cause stress for some people? How might it affect confidence and self-esteem? And how do we deal with problems? But what are the problems as well? So it's just worth considering that at this point. What we can do is move on to look at some stats, which I think can give us some context. And I like to deliver these in a trivia format. So this is an opportunity for you to think about which one out of these questions do you think they're true or false. So just be honest with yourself and write it down as we go, just to see how you might do. So number 1, there are 92 different nationalities in London. Do you think that's true or false? Write down what you think. The answer is false. So it's not even close. According to the standard in 2012, 270 different nationalities. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the statistics, and then afterwards just give you a chance to reflect. What is it telling you? Is there a message there? Number 2, 25% of the London population is BAME, or from the Black and Minority Ethnic Group, or non-white. We're going to explore phrases and ways of describing different ethnic groups. For the moment, I'm just going to use that phrase, which is commonly used as a reporting tool. But the question is, 25% of the London population is from that community. What do you think? Do you think it's true or false? The answer to that is false. It's 35%, according according to the census in 2011. Number 3, 81% of inner London pupils are from the BAME community, and 26% of teachers are from the BAME community. So there's quite a discrepancy between the two. Do you think that's true? If you do, when you're correct, that's the mix currently, or in 2017. Number 4, 75% of adults had symptoms of mental ill health before 18 years old. Would you think that's true or false? So if you're an adult today, when did those symptoms start to present? If they were before becoming an adult, and 75% of those, do you think, and then the answer you believe then is true, which is correct according to government. And interesting enough, just a deeper dive into that question, the percentage of adults with symptoms of mental health problems before they were 14 is 50%. The last question, 1 in 10 young people aged 5 to 19 would currently meet the criteria for a mental health disorder. So what do you think about that question? Do you think that's true or false? The answer is false, unfortunately. So it's actually higher than that, 1 in 8, which works out about 3 or 4. It's actually 3.6 in every class of 30 in a class. I'm not sure how you divide somebody up in that way, but it just means that in every classroom, there's going to be a handful of children who are struggling right now. So overall, what do these stats mean to you? What impact has it had on you? And yeah, just give you a moment to reflect on that. If you're working with anyone in collaboration on this session, have a discussion. What's the impacts on you? I think you can start to see that there are some clear disparities between teaching staff as well as people represented from the sort of BAME community. And what we do know is that there are performance issues for particular groups from the BAME community, particularly Black young boys from the Afro-Caribbean or ethnic origin tends to have far more of an issue in terms of performance and healthy outcomes than those of white counterparts and other ethnic groups. So this is consistent. So it's just starting to think about, well, okay, well, what's behind all of that? Maybe there's some issues around representation and other things. So certainly worth considering from that perspective. What we're going to look at next is this continuum, the mental health continuum, which for those who've done mental health first aid, you'll recognize this, but it's a good way to start to understand and measure how we're feeling, where we are on our own sort of mental health wellbeing scale. And then we use this to start to understand where we might be in relation to racism, how that might impact us. So you've got 2 axes. You've got the vertical, which is a measure of mental health, so good mental health at the top, poor mental health at the bottom. The horizontal is a measure of diagnosis of mental illness. So no diagnosis on the right. The more left you go, the more severe the diagnosis, with schizophrenia or bipolar at the far left. So we're going to start with the vertical and start with good mental health. On your piece of paper, I want you to write down all one word or phrase that comes to your mind when you think of good mental health. So if you're feeling your very, very best, what would you be thinking? What would you be feeling? What would you be doing? So just give you a moment to jot down some ideas. You can pause the video if you wish to. So maybe the things that you wish to consider would be, if you're feeling at your best, maybe a high confidence, high self-esteem, you've got lots of motivation, lots of great energy, you're driven, you've got enthusiasm, you start your day, you can't wait to get going. You know, if you've got those things in abundance, then you're going to be at the top of your game. If you're lacking those things, then you might be at the bottom, where you're struggling, you're not able to cope, not able to manage, and life and work is overwhelming for you. And that's where you would have poor mental health. The horizontal axis is a measure of mental illness diagnosis, as I said. So we're going to bring that in, and you can notice there's 4 quadrants on this spectrum. If we fill those in and explain what each sort of profile of each person in that space. Top left is someone who has a diagnosis of good mental health, but a serious mental illness. An example could be bipolar or schizophrenia. For some people, that's a contradiction. How can you have both? The reason I believe you can have both is because you have a diagnosis, but you understand it, you have great awareness to your condition, you're taking medication, you're getting professional help, got support from your friends and family, your boss, there's no reason why you can't work. And there's also good daily self-care. So excellent sleep, exercise and diet, all those things are really, really important. Go to the top right, this is someone who has no diagnosis and good mental health. So that's a good place to be. The bottom left is someone who has has a diagnosis. We use schizophrenia and bipolar again, but this person isn't coping, not able to manage the condition. Maybe it's the early stages of diagnosis, which has the highest risk. It may be that they're not taking their medication, or the medication is not working for them, don't have that support network around them. So it's really not a good place to be. Unfortunately, 25% from that quadrant, the bottom left, ends in sort of those who take their life through suicide, 25% from the bottom left, 75% from the bottom right. This is someone who unfortunately decided to end their life because life is overwhelming. They're in a poor place mentally, emotionally, not able to manage, and they believe that taking life is actually a better outcome than living, unfortunately. But just to sum this up, this slide, this is the difference between mental health and mental illness, because they're two different things. Because you can see you can have good mental health and serious diagnosis on the top left, or poor mental health and no diagnosis on the bottom right. So it's really not about diagnosis. It's about where are you on that vertical axis. In other words, anywhere in the top half, you can be flourishing. Anywhere in the bottom half, you may be struggling or languishing. Some people say, actually, Tony Robbins says, we all have an emotional home, a place where we live emotionally. This is where we spend most of our time. So I want you to consider for a moment and ask yourself, how are you doing today? Where's your emotional home? How have you been recently? What have you got going on at work, at home, and how are you managing it? So just consider for a moment, where would you put yourself on this spectrum? Where is your emotional home? For me, the most important thing is of managing our mental health is awareness. And this is the first step, the most important step. So maybe just take this moment to reflect on that. And then start to think about, so we're bringing in racism now to think about, well, how would that impact where you are on the spectrum? What do you think racism does to our mental health? How can it impact how we're feeling, how we're behaving, what we're thinking? Where might that show up in someone's life? So just some examples, if someone's treated differently, if they're treated unfairly, even in the workplace or through the criminal justice system, then it's likely to have a negative impact. Obviously, that the impact it has is going to be relative to the individual and their level of resilience, but ultimately it's likely to have a negative impact, and it can and will likely push that person further to the bottom of that spectrum. So what we're going to do now is we'll start to talk about racism, but to bring it to life a little bit more and to start to think about the different types of racism. There's 4 main types of racism, and we'll explore each one and bring it to life a little bit and get you to think about some examples that you might have to what that racism is and how might it look like and show up in our society that we live in. So we'll start with structural racism. So structural racism is where it's talking about the systems and structures in which we all live in, a society sits. So the structures around health, education, around the criminal justice system, housing, etc. And where you have structural racism, it means it's loaded against people of color and Black people in terms of the success of their life outcomes. So it's likely to hinder them, hold them back in many ways unfairly. Institutional racism, this is about those institutions which sit within the structure. So it could be schools, colleges, it could be workplace, and various other institutions, the police force, which ultimately house policies and practices which discriminate against Black people and people of color, in a way which it fails to protect them against racism and racist attitudes, and it ultimately doesn't it doesn't, it allows that to exist ultimately, because the thing is, when it exists, then it kind of feeds into the bottom, because interpersonal racism is where it's even an individual or group who overtly demonstrate racism in either verbal or physical form, so abuse, name calling, etc. But that can come from the other two, because there's a space for it to breathe and a space for it to live, and it can feed it and enable it to exist ultimately. Bottom right is the sort of internalized racism. So this is where people may inherently start to believe that they are different and inferior based on the color of their skin, and this is a highly damaging form of racism, and it exists in many countries around the world. My background is from the Caribbean. So I was born in London, but my dad is from Jamaica, my mum is from England, and so what I do know about the West Indies and many countries, and what I've seen in Jamaica, is that a lot of the media is focused on lighter skin being sort of beautiful and attractive. And for me, it's no surprising that skin lightening products exist. So a lot of people see that as a way of gaining more success. And the lighter you are, the better opportunities you'll have. And this is also evident in parts of India, within the caste system, and actually across the world, sadly. And I'll talk a little bit more about my own experiences being mixed race, because actually for me, I didn't sit one side or the other. I want you to look at these four types of racism and think about, well, what examples do you have? Where have you seen examples of any of those types of racism in your life, in your work, or your own experiences? Some of the ones which are quite public. Recently, there was obviously the BLM movement, which I think has really uncovered lots of focus on that. But long before that, the Macpherson report indicated that the Metropolitan Police in London is institutionally racist in relation to the Stephen Lawrence death, unfortunately. But you have more recent examples. As in Rafiq, I made a note of the cricketer at Yorkshire Cricket Club. It was deemed that Yorkshire Cricket Club and the board were racist. Interesting enough, their argument was that it was just banter. So the question is, well, where does banter end and where does racism start? I think that's a good perspective, because some will say, well, it's just a joke, but actually, at what level makes it acceptable? And is there harm being caused to others, to individuals, or to groups of people? And that's ultimately what happened, and continues to happen. And unfortunately, it's taken the lid off issues of racism in cricket, but also in football. We still see the kneeling by footballers trying to promote the BLM movement, and it still gets, unfortunately, a lot of criticism. But it's just trying to think, well, where would that sit on that spectrum, on those sort of four types? Which one would it kind of come from, and why does it exist? And why would people feel like they need to challenge it? So moving on, thinking about language and bias, and again, what is okay language? What can we say, and what should we avoid saying? So this will be in live sessions. This will be part of a breakout session. So for you, what I'm going to show you 12 phrases and words, and I want you to think about: are they acceptable? Are they positive? Or are they unacceptable and negative? Or maybe they sit in between. Maybe there's this kind of a neutral ground. But just I want you to see if you can decide, write down on a piece of paper which side of it fits and why. Why would it fit one side than the other? So here are the phrases. A group of black people. I don't see color. I don't see a human being. Somebody who is half caste. How would you describe your ethnicity as a question? Do you think that's an acceptable question? AIM, Black and minority ethnic groups, is that a good description? People of colour, how do you feel about that as a definition of a group of people? The phrase, I have lots of black friends, I can't be racist. All lives matter, not just black people's. When I feel depressed, I feel a big black cloud descends over me. The N word, the P word. Number 12, you are a black woman. What do you think about those words and phrases and why? So have some thinking, have some discussion if you're in a group. Where does that land for you? And you can pause the video at this point. Okay, so hopefully you've had some good thoughts around those. One thing I would report back on, and having the multiple discussions of these phrases, certainly in the live session of this actual course, it was quite difficult to get to a definitive as to is it acceptable or isn't. Some things were very clear, some things weren't so clear. I think there was no discussion about number 10 and 11. BAME came up, and POC, people of colour, but there was also difficulty in knowing what to say. And I think it's healthy that we can have that discussion, and I think that's how we move forward. It was it actually led to one of the points, number 4, being, you know, the question of how would you describe your ethnicity? Because I think if in doubt, why not just ask? And I think that can be a good way of understanding, or what are you? Because actually one thing that was evident in the sessions I delivered was that people who look the same don't identify in the same way. So don't make assumptions, ask questions, I think is one of the safer options. We'll talk about that more in terms of the conversation a bit later. It'd be good to for you to jot down your thoughts and maybe talk this through with other people. So what we're going to move on to now is the frame of reference, and this is in leading into a video that I'm going to show you by a very fantastic speaker on this topic. But a frame of reference, if you've done mental health first aid, is something you're familiar with. So it's getting you to think about, well, I mean, firstly, let me explain what frame of reference is. It's ultimately your window of the world, which is your filter to how you see the world. In other words, the world isn't a reflection of it, it's a reflection of you. It's like holding a mirror up, because you see it through all your life experiences, and your attitudes and beliefs are formed from those life experiences up until this very moment in time. The examples on the screen are things that may have impacted and shaped your perspective on mental health. And what this exercise is getting you to think about is, what are those attitudes and beliefs and your window on the world in relation to racism and race? And perhaps just getting you to start to think about, well, is there any biases that you carry? It's been said that we all carry bias. So what does that look like for you? And so you may want to just pause the video just to consider, does any of those areas trigger any of your own thoughts and beliefs around race, around racism? What are they? And this activity is not about judgment. It's not about being negative or judgmental as to what you might find. It's just being open and honest, and then being able to take this forward to understand it. Well, if it's like that, well, why is it like that? And what can you learn from it? So I'm going to show you a video next by a lady called Jane Elliott. For me, is an incredible speaker on this topic. Can be quite provocative and controversial, but it's a good way to start to think about maybe any bias that you may carry. It's based on an exercise she called Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes. She carried it out probably 3 decades ago, at least, maybe 4. And it was focused on having people sort of treated differently, not because of their colours of their skin, but because of the colour of their eyes. It was an experiment to see how people responded to it. And she actually done the exercise also on the Oprah Winfrey Show, which is available on YouTube. you just type in Jane Elliott and Oprah Winfrey, it was basically groups of the audience who never knew that they were part of the experiment, and then they got told later on, but it's interesting to see people's reaction to it. So this video is about 4 minutes 20 long. So I'll play the video for you, and then you can have a view on some discussions amongst yourself and thoughts as to how it might impact you. Here we go.
I was teaching 3rd grade in Riceville, Iowa. I walked into my house. The telephone was ringing. I answered the telephone. My sister said, "Is your television on?" I said, "No." She said, "You better turn it on." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because they shot him." I said, "Who do we shoot this time?" And she said, "Martin Luther King Jr." And I couldn't for a minute think that the world was still spinning. There was no way I could explain the ignorance and the lack of civility and the unchristian behavior that this country was exhibiting with the killing of Martin Luther King Jr. And I was crying, and I was upset, and I was angry, I was furious. And I got my husband's supper ready. He worked at Oliver at night at that time. And when he came home, I said, "Tomorrow, brown-eyed people are going to be on the top in my classroom, and blue-eyed people are going to be on the bottom." He said, "Jane, you'll lose your job." I said, "If I lose my job for teaching something they need to know, I don't want to teach her." So I went to school. The first student in my classroom came in. They said, "Hey, they shot that king last night. Why'd they shoot that king?" I said, "We're going to talk about that." And I asked those kids what they knew about black people. And they knew every negative stereotype that I had ever heard about black people, and some that had never occurred to me. And I said, "Do you kids have any idea how it would feel to be something other than white in this country?" "No." "Would you like to know?" Yeah. It was like we've already gotten on spelling and handwriting. Keep this broad talking. We don't have to learn anything all day long. So I said, "Okay, today we're going to judge people by the color of their eyes. Brown-eyed kids are going to be on top the first day of this exercise." They said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean, blue-eyed people aren't as smart as brown-eyed people. They aren't as clean as brown-eyed people. They aren't as civilized as brown-eyed people." And at that point, little brown-eyed Debbie, sitting in the front row, and this had only been 3 minutes, looked up at me and said, "How come you're the teacher if you got them blue eyes?" And I thought, oh, this is how this works, isn't it? Here, this little 8-year-old girl can attack her teacher who has been to college, finished high school, and she has the right to attack me now because she has the right color eyes and I have the wrong color eyes. I couldn't believe what happened that day. A tall, blonde, beautiful, brilliant girl came into my room in February, reading at the 6th grade level in 3rd grade. She had never multiplied. I taught her how to multiply the first 15 minutes of math class. On the day she had the wrong color eyes, that brilliant little girl made mistakes in reading, made mistakes in spelling, and forgot how to multiply. She came in from recess crying. I said, "What's going on here?" As she walked across the playground, 2 brown-eyed Debbies and a brown-eyed Cindy stepped up behind her, reached up, struck her across the back with her forearm, and when Carol turned around, Debbie said to her, "Now you have to apologize to me for getting in my way, because I'm better than you are." And Carol apologized and came in crying. No person of any age will ever leave my presence with those attitudes unchallenged. I can't change your attitude, but I can challenge your attitude, and you have to prove to me that so-called white people are superior to everybody else on the face of the earth, and you can't do it because it isn't true. People are wondering whether what she did 52 years ago should be relevant today. In 52 years, we should have solved this problem. I am so determined that we change the education system in this country. I am so determined that we change what we're educating people to believe. There's only one race on the face of the earth, and that's the human race. Once we get that into the heads of our legislators, we'll have a different kind of law written. Once we get that into the heads of the police, we'll have a different law enforcement. Once we get that into the heads of educators, we'll have different education. We thought we stopped Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream by killing him. His dream is more alive now than it was when he was living, and you have proof of it by what's going on in every major city in the United States of America right now. Racism isn't about skin color. It's about white fear of different kinds of people. It's not skin color that's the problem. The skin color isn't the problem. You can't change skin color. You can change attitudes.
So, what are your thoughts on that video? I think it's very thought-provoking. Maybe just take a moment to reflect on how you found it, what stood out for you. But I think it's certainly got some messages in there in terms of the impact. Even just a very light experiment of that nature, how it started to impact performance. That little girl lost her ability to perform, and yeah, it's quite an interesting one. So hopefully that's a good exercise for you to start to think about your own perspectives and maybe what views you have in yourself, and how we can look at them objectively and move forward and maybe make some changes if necessary. What we're going to look at next is the impact of racial disparities, firstly by pointing out and looking at some facts and statistics around each one. And this is normally as an exercise in breakout groups. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to look at each area and just think about what might be the impacts on mental health. You know, how might those racial disparities impact someone's mental health and well-being? So the first one is education, which is obviously very, very relevant to the field that you may be in. So just looking at the facts and statistics on the screen. So consistent underachievement from Black students, low expectations by teachers and the system, a lack of race-focused initiatives on poor outcome groups. So it's not, the education and curriculum isn't around necessarily relatable topics for some groups. Exclusion rates 6 times higher for Black children in parts of London and UK. 46% of schools in England have no teachers from the BAME community. You know, how might that impact mental health? And just a deeper dive into that number, only 2% of heads are from the BAME community in England. School curriculum and lesson plans, once again, are they focused on providing kind of education and awareness outside of Black History Month? And that's if the schools are even using that as an opportunity. And there was a review recently, or an article by a Black governor, in as much that she managed to implement, this is on the BBC, implement year-round education on Black history. So what might impact that have? What might be the impact of not having that? And more about history in terms of Black people's contribution, you know, towards World War II from Commonwealth countries. So lots of things to consider. Have some thought as to what impact that might have on mental health. Moving forward, thinking about the criminal justice system. You know, here's some other facts. So Black people are arrested for a drug offence that's 6 times the rate of white people. They are then found guilty of this offence 4.5 times the rate and are subject to immediate custody at 5 times the rate of white people. Asian people are arrested at almost twice the rate of white population. And Black males are subject to the use of force by the police at 4 times the rate of white people. Why do you think that might be? That's a good question to start with. Why might that be? Why is it that famous footballers like Dalian Atkinson is a good example where he was killed at the hands of police? He was a well-known professional footballer. He was deemed to have had some mental health issues, but the force used by the police officers was deemed to be excessive, and they were convicted as such. And there was actually footprints from their boots on his head, and that was directly related to his cause of death. So why has that happened? And unfortunately, that's not an isolated incident. But just why is it that Black people are likely to be convicted at a higher rate. So what's behind that, and what might the impact on mental health? Because if you're going down a criminal justice path and you're developing mental health issues, which we know a high proportion of prisoners have, then what we do know is that pathway to receiving the treatment is through the criminal justice system is going to be far more, it's not going to be as a healthy route as then going down a more considered and empathetic approach, which is what we look at in terms of the next one. So, which is the first point, which it can mean that the treatment isn't given or it's not sufficient. Either way, it's combined with being within the criminal justice system, which is very harsh. Black patients are at least 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act than white people. Why is that? What impacts might that have on mental health? What we do know about being sectioned is that it can be a traumatic incident in itself. So it's not likely to help. It can be deemed as the best option in some instances, but it's certainly not a great outcome. And so what's the impact of that higher rate of detention than over white people? For what's the impact on Black people and people from the BAME community? Interesting stat from the pandemic: 85% of doctors who die from COVID-19 were from the ethnic minority backgrounds. Why is that? And it's good to consider that, because all doctors are on the front line, surely, or maybe what I understand is perhaps more from certain groups which are put in more risky environments. But why has that happened, and how is that able to happen? Lastly, ethnic minority groups are more likely to be prescribed antidepressants and other forms of medication, so the talking therapies. What we do know is that unfortunately can lead to a higher rate of dependency on the medication, and what we do know is that can lead to less successful outcomes in the longer term over instead of talking therapies, which tends to have a higher rate. So if there's it appears that they are more likely to be prescribed that route, well, why is that happening in the first instance? What's the impact? And the impact, as I just mentioned, can be negative experiences of mental health, and unfortunately remaining in the bottom half, that continuing for much longer, and unfortunately less self-able, sufficient to be able to take care of themselves. But what are your thoughts? It'd be good for you to jot down some of your own ideas and just think about that. Okay, so moving on to one of the last parts of the session is how can we have a conversation around race? What does that look like? And for me, any conversation around mental health and race is in 3 parts. You've got the preparation, and you've got the actual conversation, then the action. What's the follow-up and the result of that conversation? And maybe we need to do more and have more conversations, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's solved in the first instance. That's where we go around that cycle, that wheel. And I'll just go into each one in a little bit more detail, just providing some tips of how to have those healthy conversations. So the preparation, firstly is, how do you feel about the conversation? Are you in a place where you can have it? Maybe you need to compose yourself, maybe it's not the right time. Maybe actually it needs to be done in a different environment or a different time, but just getting yourself in the right mind space, I think, is really, really important. Do you have any negative judgments against the individual? Would you be able to listen to them fairly? Would there be any negative judgments which stop you from listening? And what outcomes do you want from the conversation? Is it just, do you want to just be able to understand where that person's coming from? Do you want to change their perspective? Or is there disciplinary with the individual? Is there something which needs to be, it needs to be tackled and going down a disciplinary route? Or maybe it's someone who's the victim of some kind of racism and it's had an impact on them, and you want to comfort them, support them. But having that clarity would be really helpful in terms of your personal preparation. The environmental could be, well, where do you have that conversation? It'd be face-to-face, is it virtual? When it's just formal or informal, as I mentioned, it could be that you just want to have an informal chit chat. You just want to make someone aware of something they've said or done, and you wasn't happy with it, or you felt that actually they need to be made aware of it to maybe help them make some change, or maybe it is a more formal route as opposed to it's a disciplinary. So it's good to be clear on that. And how are you going to approach them? What were you going to say in the first instance? For me, not coming from a kind of blame culture or an aggressive approach, because what you want to do is, and there's no reason to be aggressive, but you want to be clear. You want to be what's the word I'm looking for? You want to be confident about how you do it without being arrogant or aggressive. So hopefully the point that you're making, they can receive it and understand it and hopefully move forward. So that's a preparation. In terms of the actual conversation, listening skills is essential here. So basics, really, what we're talking about here, lots of open questions, asking questions with a what, where, how, who, and when. Try and understand that person's perspective, narrative, where they're coming from. They're making it I-based, so I believe that, or I've seen that, or I feel that is a good way of starting a conversation. So it's not about what other people are saying or what you've heard from other people's, but just your own perspectives, and just based on facts. So that's where you want to get to. You want to get to the truth. So listening for that, understanding, okay, well, what's really happening? Where did this come from? And trying to really open up on that from that perspective. Using empathy, which I mentioned, is not about being judgmental. It's just being able to listen and understand their emotions. Where are they coming from? Sometimes, when we go back to that 4 types of racism, it's institutional doesn't necessarily mean I'm consciously racist. It could be actually the way I'm thinking and behaving isn't conscious at all, but I don't understand the impact of it. So it's the way that we can learn is when we're not judged in that way, but if we could help the individual to see the issues or the errors or the ways or the impact it's having on others, then that's an opportunity for learning for them. So avoid blaming and shaming, but also in regards to a conversation, if you're a person of color or black person, it's not your responsibility to educate. So people need to do that research themselves. What you can do is just share your thoughts and feelings around it, and also recognize that you may not be the expert. In fact, I'm not the expert. This is a learning journey for all of us. So it's about trying to understand, okay, how are you feeling about it? And maybe that you're not the right person to have that conversation, but certainly I think the communication needs to be made. So what are the action points? So thinking about, you've had the conversation, you understand where this person is, maybe what they need to happen is to be signposted some professional health services, which will be incorporated as part of this session, which will be can be obtained through Thrive LDN. And I'll provide the details at the end. There's lots of services which you can gain support, guidance, and professional help in relation to racism and mental health. Managers can be prepared to offer support. Once again, it doesn't mean that you have all the answers, but we need to listen to any kind of grievance or issue around racism is so important, just to be able to have that conversation. And sometimes walking away from it is the best step. So ongoing to, if it's caused issues and incidents, being able to escalate it if necessary, as I mentioned, disciplinary, or maybe there's some support and guidance that people need. And maybe also what it has triggered is awareness of a need for policy change. And this is very healthy, in fact, and a lot of organizations are having to focus on policy and practice in relation to becoming an anti-racist organization. MHFAE England have driven that policy both publicly, so sent the message out publicly. The report is on the internet, it's publicly available, their statement, and also internally, so how they operate, ensuring that there's no discrimination against anyone from a different nationality, race, ethnicity, and any kind of group, sexual identity. It's really important that happens, and these kind of messages are reinforced. So policy change is really healthy, which is obviously a much bigger conversation, but it's done from sort of senior leadership team down. Here are some of the resources which are available in terms of support for you, educational support, that helpline there. You can jot these down, but these will also be on the handout. It's set up for people within education. So if that's your field, you can call a number. It's run by people in that space, supporting mental health and issues that we've talked about today. Young Minds are focused on young people, particularly around mental health issues, but things like race and racism and other things which impact certain groups, it can also be a big part of that. So certainly give them a call. It's not just for young people, but it's for carers of young people. It's a really, really great organisation. Mind have a specific programme, Young Black Men programme, which if you go on the Mind website, mind.org.uk, which is specifically designed, as it says on the tin, to provide information, awareness, and support for Black people and people of colour. Local Minds, which are independent around the country, they run different programmes depending on their location, but many Minds in London will have programmes for BAME communities around some of the topics we talked about today. Lambeth has a specific project, I should say, called Black Thrive, which is incredible. Certainly have a look and Google that, have a look on the website. And there's a great tool for finding BAME services, Hub of Hope. So hubofhope.co.uk. That's hubofhope.co.uk. There's also an app. If you type in a postcode, and if you search under BAME support, it lists a whole load of services in that vicinity, and with all the contact details. So it's a really great search engine for that. So we've come to the end of the session. I'm just going to summarize what we covered. So we looked at race, we looked at racism. What are they? Trying to understand the basics and how it impacts mental health. We looked at the continuums of good mental health and poor mental health. We started to think about how might racism impact that, and we built some context around this by looking at some statistics. Then we explored the 4 types of racism. Start to think about what experience have you had and where they sit in terms of their own in terms of racism types. And then we spoke about language. What's appropriate language, healthy language, what language should we remove, and what isn't inappropriate. Then we explored frame of reference. And lastly, the next steps, as I mentioned, can be to check out the Thrive LDN website, which is on your screen. The helpful resources for Black people, people of colour, as I mentioned, can be picked up by MHFAE England through Thrive LDN. So Nadia, I believe, was the holder of that. MHFAE England have a great space on their website called under resources, My Whole Self, which is designed for and it provides free resources for workplaces. It covers generally the message about being authentic and bringing your whole self to work, which includes embracing and understanding your own ethnicity and race, and being able to express that openly in the workplace. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks for following the session. Hopefully it's been provocative, and hopefully it's brought some ideas and understand awareness for you to understand your own mental health and how racism sits within your own experiences, how you can start to have conversations with people, and maybe just give you a greater understanding of context behind some of those approaches. Thank you very much. Hope to come cross paths again in the future. I'm Yohan McDonald. Thank you. Bye-bye.